What is it that makes us believe phenomenon? What is it that makes us or draws us to experience? What is it that makes it so exciting when things happen of a phenomenological nature that we are willing sometimes to forget and forego that Christ is the cornerstone? And I'm going to suggest to you that at least part of the reason for that, part of the reason why we want stuff to happen, and why sometimes when stuff happens, we are willing to kind of let go of things that are more important than the stuff that's happening, is because we forget who we are. As a result, maybe, of things going sideways in our lives, of people going sideways, of circumstances happening that we don't quite know how to make sense of. When we have an identity crisis, that's often when we are most open to being seduced by phenomenology. That's when we are most often open to getting lost in the deep weeds of phenomenal experiences. I don't want to undermine the phenomenon. God can do some pretty amazing things. Just look outside, right? And in fact, sometimes the norm of the awe that we ought to greet the morning with gets lost in the fireworks of our experiences, right? And we often then give more value or credence to those who have had those experiences than perhaps their character might support. Because remember, the real mark of the Spirit is not the gifts of the Spirit, not the phenomena. The real work of the Spirit, the everyday in and out work of the Spirit, really is going to be seen as you follow people around and see love and joy and peace and patience and gentleness and meekness and temperance and goodness produced in their lives, right? That's the real mark. Not whether people are healed, as wonderful as that is. Not whether people have words, as wonderful as those words may or may not be. Not whether we have experienced the phenomena, which in and of themselves are really pretty cool. And I've, as a classical Pentecostal growing up for the last, 60 years of my life in a Pentecostal revival type frame, I've seen some pretty amazing things. And at the end of the day, I want to say to you, give me Jesus. Give me Jesus. Everything else fades. He's the cornerstone. Everything else fades. But He's the cornerstone. At the same time, I can understand why when we're in an identity crisis, when we forget who we are, when life goes sideways, when things happen, boy, those, boy, that's attractive. Right? And the possibilities, of course, are that we get seduced by those things, that we get taken sideways by those things. Of course, the truth is, this is not a new experience for us. It's not a new experience for the people of God. I want you to sit with me this morning in a conversation on somebody whose life was marked by phenomena, somebody whose life would merit at least one or two books and a book tour and maybe frequent television appearances. Because as far as I know, nobody in this room, nobody that I know of, has ever made it not rain by His word. That by itself, by the way, that's worthy of a book right there, don't you think? If you can make it stop raining by the declaration of your word for 3.5 years, that's good. And if you can end that period of time where it hasn't rained for 3.5 years by calling down fire from heaven on national television, That's a good day's work right there. And if at the end of that day you can make it rain again at your command, that's pretty good, wouldn't you say? Wouldn't you say that guy probably ought to just retire right now because it can't get any better than that? Wouldn't you say that guy, and you know who I'm talking about, Elijah, one of the great prophets of the Old Testament, who had each, and by the way, in those 3.5 year period of time when it wasn't raining, he had some other amazing things happen. Provision and protection and awareness of what God was doing in the camps of the enemy, and on and on and on and on the list goes. But after that day, and you know the event that I'm talking about in 1 Kings chapter 18, where the fire fell from heaven at his request, affirming the majesty of the Lord God, creator of heaven and earth, as opposed to the pretend god Baal. You know what happened? That phenomenon was not enough for Elijah when a text came from Jezebel, the wife of King Ahab, against whom Elijah was focusing his prophetic diatribes. And Jezebel's message to Elijah was, if you're not dead within 24 hours, then my name isn't Jezebel. He was afraid. I need you to sit with this for just a minute. Fire from heaven. 450 prophets of Baal executed by the end of the day. His enemies that he recognizes as God's enemies. The rain begins to fall for the first time in 3.5 years. And he gets a text, he gets a message from one woman that sends him into a panicked frenzy. What happened? And the truth is, any of you who have been engaged in any kind of ministry know what happened. When you lead worship, when you preach, when you do evangelism, when you take a missions trip, right? There's an adrenaline surge that fuels, in some ways, that ministry. And then on how does the body deal with that surge of adrenaline maybe even after an athletic contest, right? Or after a high stakes competition? What happens? You peak in that adrenaline, in that moment of conflict or ministry or warfare, whatever it is, and then the adrenaline starts to drain, and as it does, you are introduced to God's gift called depression. Right? Depression is God's gift to us to enable the restoration of normal as adrenaline drains. It's common, it's ordinary, it happens. It'll happen to me after speaking today. And if you just leave it alone, in 24 hours or less, you'll be fine again. But when did Jezebel's text arrive, do you think? Right when he was on the down cycle, right when just a little bit of a push pushed this prophet over the edge. He who had called down fire from heaven had made it rain. Now I was afraid. And so he runs. He's having, if you can, bear with me in this, a moment. I think that her text called into question, her message called into question whether he was right or wrong. I think his identity was questioned. He was in the middle of what, for lack of a better term, we'll call an identity crisis. He forgot who he was. And that happens, doesn't it? It just happens. When things go sideways. How many know what I'm talking about? You have a friend who betrays you, you have a disappointment, you have a frustration, go sideways. You forget who you are, you forget who God is. especially in that moment. So here he is. He's running for his life. Finally ended up in Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left there as servant. And then he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a juniper tree. He requested for himself that he might die. It's enough now, Lord. Take my life. I'm not better than my father's. So this story gets the text, takes off running. You remember that Mount Carmel is in the far north of the country, and he does not stop running until he gets to Beersheba in the far south of the country, leaves his servant there. 250 miles he has run as a result of this message from Jezebel. Goes over the border into the desert where now he is outside of the political reach of Jezebel, falls under a tree and begs to die. This is how depressed, how down he is, how much he has forgotten what happened 24 hours ago. And it happens when we forget who we are. And so he is out under the tree, and the next thing he knows, he is being shaken awake by an angel. And the angel said, "Arise and eat." And there, on a rock, by his head, in the middle of the desert, is a still steaming, freshly baked loaf of bread and a jar of water. He does not question for a moment how it got there. God has been providing for him in similar ways for 3.5 years. He just assumes the supernatural as normal. He gets up, he eats the bread, he drinks the cold water, and then goes back to sleep again. Then the angel wakes him up again, shaking him on the shoulder and says, "Arise and eat, for the journey you are on is too great for you." And there again, on the rock by his head, a still steaming, freshly baked loaf of bread and a jar of cold water. He gets up, he eats and he drinks, and the text says, in the strength of that food, he went 40 days and 40 nights into the desert, which we know as good scholars of the Old Testament, 40 always means something's going to happen, right? It's a time of testing. It's a time of refining. It's a time of refocusing. It's a time of remembering. So as he goes into the desert, into the heat of that furnace, he knows that something is happening. And it's fascinating to me as we look back at that text when the angel wakes him up and says to him, "Arise and eat, for the journey you are on is too great for you." The question becomes, when did it become a journey? His identity crisis has pushed him into terrified flight. And now, by the grace of God, it has become a journey not from, but to something. And I want to just pause for a moment and suggest to you that sometimes in the places of your deepest, darkest shame and fear, the terror that drives you into escape becomes, by the grace of God, fuel for a journey that is too great for you. Something happens as a result of that crisis that could not happen had you not had the crisis. God never wastes a crisis in your life. Right? So he's running away and then discovers by the grace of God that he's running to. And by the grace of God that he now has capacity, fuel for that journey given to him by the angel of the Lord. And when he runs, he goes another days or two journey into the desert and comes to Horeb, the mountain of God, which we now know primarily as Sinai, the place where Moses received the 10 words, the place where God meets his people for the first time and frames them into his people, the place of phenomenal experience with God to parallel the phenomenal experience of Mount Carmel that Elijah has had 40 days ago. And he gets there, and the text says that he hides himself in a cleft in the rock, which, because you are all good Jewish scholars, knows is significant. Because the cleft in the rock on this mountain, Mount Sinai, is the very place that God put Moses in Exodus 32 and 33. When God himself revealed himself at Moses' request, show me your glory, God says, okay, hides him in a cleft in the rock, covers him with his hand, passes by so that Moses can see where God was. That's that cleft in the rock. You want to guess why Elijah is there? It's not just a visit to Missouri or to some Mecca or to some sacred place. It's a place where we've met God before. How many of y'all know that sometimes when you're in an identity crisis, the first place you go is where you've met God before? A song that you haven't heard for months and months, maybe years, all of a sudden becomes your soundtrack. And what is the longing of our hearts in the moment of identity crisis where fear fuels journey? What is the longing of our hearts? What do we want God to do? We want him to show up phenomenally, right? So here he is in the cleft of the rock where Moses has met God. And the voice of the Lord comes to him and says, "What are you doing here, Elijah? What are you doing here, Elijah?" Now I can't channel God very well, but I'm thinking that probably God is somewhat, I don't know if this is okay for me to say to you out loud, but anybody else have a semi-sarcastic God every once in a while? And listen to the emphasis. What are you doing here, Elijah? Why would he ask it that way, do you think? What are you, the prophet of Mount Carmel, the place where fire fell and you made it rain? What are you, Elijah, doing here where I met Moses? What are you trying to do? Recover some of that? Ask me to do it again? Praying what C.S. Lewis says are God's least likely prayers to be answered, namely the prayers for encore. Do it again. Do the big stuff again. Show me what you got. And Elijah complains. I've been very zealous for the Lord your God. He goes on and says, let me just read it. I've been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the sons of Israel have forsaken your covenant. They've torn down your altars. They've killed your prophets with the sword. I'm the only one left, and they're trying to seek my life and take it away. Anybody else noted that when you throw your own pity party, that you tend to exaggerate what got you into the bottom of the pit of resentment? Anybody else? Whenever you tell your own story, it gets worse. Right? And so here he is. I'm the only one left. They're trying to kill me, etc. Well, part of that was true. And God, rather than responding to his frustrated, angry prophet, said, well, show up at the front of the mountain, like with Moses. So God's setting him up. He's creating an expectation, right? So Elijah goes to the front of the mountain, just that inside that cleft in the rock, you know? He's expecting any minute now to feel the presence of the Lord's hand covering him there, like he covered Moses there, so that when the Lord passes by, Elijah will have an experience and be able to see where God was. I'm ready for this. I've gone to the site. I've gone to the place. I've gone to the sacred moment of meeting. Here it comes, here it comes, here it comes. And all of a sudden, he begins to feel the wind picking up. Oh, this is so cool, because how did God show up on this mountain the last time we were here? He showed up in wind. In fact, he's going to show up in wind again in a few centuries. In Acts chapter 2, verse 4, the wind of the Spirit blowing through that room, that same wind is beginning to blow. And this wind is so powerful, so strong, so mighty, that it tears at, fragments the mountain, and is blowing rocks in front of it. That is one powerful wind. And you can hear Elijah, you can see him in there squinting his eyes in the force of the hurricane gale of what he assumes is God's presence. And finally he comes to the conclusion, God's not in the wind. God is not in the phenomenon that previously accompanied his presence. But then he feels the ground begin to shake under him. He feels the rocks begin, he sees the dust vibrating, and he knows, earthquake, earthquake, earthquake. That signals God's presence. At least it did the last time we were on this mountain. Moses experienced the earthquake like he had experienced the wind. Maybe this is the moment. This is the moment I'll experience God. Phenomena. And then comes to the sad and sorry conclusion. God's not in the earthquake. And then, to add insult to injury, fire falls from heaven. Why do you think God might have used fire falling from heaven to tease Elijah? Anybody have a God that teases you? No? Just me? Okay, that's fine. That's fine. You'll meet him someday if you're following the real one, because he does this. Fire falls from heaven. Why? Well, here Moses met God in fire falling from heaven, but more specifically, Elijah, 43 days before, met God in fire falling from heaven. What is Elijah's prayer? What is his desire? What is his deepest need? Having this identity crisis that thrust him into a journey of exploration. He just wants the phenomena that he has experienced God with before. Show me this stuff and I'll believe in you. Really? Really? And then after the fire, because God was not in the fire this time, the Hebrew says the sound of the thin silence. And at that, Elijah, whose heart had been shaped by a lifetime of phenomena, recognizes God isn't mostly in the big stuff. In fact, sometimes the big stuff distracts you from where God is present. And he goes and bows down at the front of the cave because God is speaking in the stillness. Nothing wrong with phenomena. Just don't be seduced by it. Don't be waylaid by it. Let God bring whatever God brings when he comes. Don't seek the that, seek the him. Why? Because what you will discover is what Elijah discovered. All of the phenomenon, all of the wonder, all of the powerful stuff of God's presence will soon fade and will no longer be enough for you. Why? Because God wants us to learn that if he is not enough, nothing he brings will be. And please notice, when we are facing an identity crisis, what do we want? We want the confirmation. We want the stuff. We want the signs. We want the stuff. Nothing wrong with the stuff. But please notice, if you don't believe in him without it, you won't believe in him with it. If you don't follow him without it, you won't follow him with it. You'll get seduced by the Grand Canyon of his glory and forget there's a voice behind that speaking, still, small, silent. It's really hard, isn't it? Having grown up as I did as a classical Pentecostal, like I said, I had all kinds of things happen in my lifetime. Watched things happen, phenomenal miracles of various kinds. Nothing like this. No fire falling, ever, as far as I know. And what do I end? Here I am. How do I end? Give me Jesus. I just want him. He can bring whatever gifts he wants, and I will sit with open hands and receive whatever he brings. I just want him. You know why? Brian alluded to this a week ago or so. Because like the prophet Isaiah said, those who wait on the Lord will do what? Remember? Mount up with wings like eagles. Run and not get weary. But the real drumbeat of Isaiah's desire for our hearts and souls, the real hard work that comes out of waiting on the Lord, is not riding the wings like eagles or running without getting weary. That stuff is purely and simply the work of God's grace. You can't do that without him. But he wants you to know that the real hard work of walking without falling over, the day in and day out, sometimes drudgery of obedience in the same direction, that requires really supernatural empowerment. That's why we are so easily seduced by the latest, biggest, bestest, mostest, fastest phenomena. Even if it, in and of itself, isn't a bad thing, it can take us sideways from the one thing. Let's pray.
At Vanguard University, your story matters. Where will it take you next? For more information, please visit vanguard.edu.